I am here to tell you that we live in a crazy, wacky, unpredictable world. The scientific term for this unpredictability is non-stationary. The climate is non-stationary. It's changing in ways that we can't predict. Our economic system is non-stationary. Our social system is non-stationary. Our technological systems are changing in ways that are difficult to predict. So when we live in a non-stationary world, how are we supposed to plan? How are we supposed to manage environmental systems? So given that unpredictability, we become very interested in resilience. We need to be able to absorb disturbances. We need to be able to recover quickly from disturbance. And so I'm here today to talk to you about resilience, or watershed resilience in a changing world. I'm delighted to be here at the Water Center, which is one I've had a delightful visit here, but it's just the kind of institution, multidisciplinary, kind of focused on stakeholders, trying to solve problems, that is the exact type of modern academic unit that we need to face the crazy, wacky, unpredictable, non-stationary world that we live. So I'm very glad to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me. I've had a very good time. And I am going to talk about a few things, right? So I'm going to first give a little bit of some thoughts about the topic of resilience, which, again, I've tried to make the case this is an important topic, but it's a challenging one, and I'm going to make the case that this is a challenging topic. And I'm going to give some examples of work on resilience from a long-term ecological research site that I work at, the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest in New Hampshire. And then, since I'm here from New York City, I couldn't resist giving at least some examples of resilience from New York City. Okay, resilience is, in a certain way, it's an easy concept, but in a certain way it's a very difficult concept because it means something to everyone, but it doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. So I think many of us have probably been to scientific meetings about a certain topic, we'll use resilience as one, where we say, all right, we're going to talk about resilience. And people say, well, we can't talk about resilience until we have a definition that we all agree on. And the only definition I'm going to agree to is the one that I came in the room with. And so these are very short scientific discussions because they go nowhere. And so people can use this difference in definition as a point of contention. A highlight for me, we were having a site review at one of our long-term ecological research sites. One of our site review team members, was a distinguished scientist from another university, looked at us and said, you can't talk about resilience because we don't agree on the definition. We'd been studying resilience for 50 years at the site at the time. We didn't agree with the site review team member, but they were on the site review team, so we stopped talking about resilience. But as soon as they left, we went back to talking about it. But it shows that this is a difficult concept. And as scientists, we haven't particularly made it any easier, right? So as scientists, I think we've got, as academics in particular, we've got a great ability to take straightforward concepts and make them impenetrably complex. And resilience is one of those, and I'll give some examples. My favorite example is the canopy diagram, which is an interesting tool in resilience that I still don't understand. I've been looking at it for 10 years. So there's some problems with definitions, and there are some problems with complexity. And I've been thinking about this for a long time ago. So in 2006, I was involved with an EPA project, and they asked us to write a prospectus on ecological thresholds, which are very, I'll talk about how they're tied up with resilience. And we were like, are ecological thresholds really going to help us manage environmental systems in a complex world? Or do they just help us to think about them? Are they an important concept with no practical application? And that's what we face with resilience. I mean, it means something to everybody, but my question is, can we use it in some way that's really going to help us in a complex world? So, resilience is a complex topic and a challenging topic, but I think we're making some progress, and that's the theme of my talk today, is that we're making some progress. And the first help came, at least for me, came from the social sciences. So the social scientists have a term they call boundary spanning object. So they say we all have a different definition of resilience, but instead of using that as a point of contention, let's use it as a point of departure. So we'll all bring our definitions to the table, and we'll use that richness as a point of departure, and we'll build an integrated understanding of resilience. Now, social scientists deal with this all the time. So if you talk to social scientists and you say, you have a word that means different things to different people, they're like, tell me about it. That's what their whole life is in social science. And so they've been very helpful in helping us to say, okay, if you're going to deal with resilience, because people want, when we talk to stakeholders, they really get the idea that the world is unpredictable and they want to build resilience, they want to talk about resilience. We need to figure out some ways to talk about them. Focusing on boundary spanning objects has been helpful. The other thing I want to talk a lot about today is some new approaches to quantification where we focus on variance. We focus on variance as an indicator of changes in resilience, and we borrow some concepts from economics, the idea of early warning signals or leading indicators to focus on resilience in environmental systems. And then the other big driver is that non-stationarity is everywhere. We have these climate events that we never thought we were going to have. We've had pandemics that we never thought we were going to have. We've had economic events that we never thought we were going to have. We have the emergence of novel ecosystems and biological communities all over the place. We're interested in restoration, but the question is, we can't restore ecosystems, this idea of return to Neverland from Peter Pan. You can't go back to what it is. And everybody wants to talk about this. So whether it's scientists, engineers, decision makers, conservation managers, the general public, they all want to talk about resilience. And that's an opportunity for us. And the question is, can we overcome the challenges and kind of take advantage of this opportunity? Okay, so let's go back and talk a little bit about what we mean by resilience. So there are two terms that I think many of us are familiar with from an introductory biology or an introductory ecology classes: resistance and resilience. So I'm a forest ecologist, so we think about resistance as how hard does the wind have to blow before the trees fall over? So you get a big wind and eventually all the trees fall over, and the resistance to that wind stress is exceeded, and so the trees fall over. And resilience is how quickly does the forest grow back? How quickly does it recover from that disturbance? And there are these useful diagrams. Sometimes they're useful, sometimes they're not. There are these diagrams where we look at, let's see if I can. I really like the laser pointer thing in PowerPoint. Look at that. That's the best thing. Okay, so I've got this system. This is my environmental system. And it's in this valley, and if the walls of the valley are steep, so if I have a disturbance that pushes the system up the wall, if the walls are steep, it comes back quickly. This is a highly resilient system. It stays within its valley, and if it gets pushed off the valley center, it comes back pretty quickly. Another way of looking at resilience is how much disturbance would I need to push the system over the rim and into another system. This is where the idea of ecological thresholds. This is an ecological thresholds. And so again, these are concepts that we can understand. We can understand that there's different forms of resilience, and we can also understand that we can push a system, exceed its resilience, and push it into a different state. Now, again, this is developed. This is the Cary diagram, which tries to talk about resilience in time and space. And you can stare at this for a long time. And if you figure it out, send me a note, but I haven't figured it out yet. You could also try and read these papers, right? So here's a clarifying example about critical slowing down, right? And I have a PhD, but I still couldn't get through this paper particularly well. And again, as academics, we're pretty good at taking a concept that people are interested in and making it impenetrable. It's not doing anybody any good. But there is a lot in this paper that I'm going to talk about, in particular these ideas about variance. So the thing the concept that I think has been useful is the idea of, can we use changes in variance as an indicator of changes in resilience? So here's my system. This is a high resilience system. You see it's a steep valley. The system gets disturbed and it gets pushed down. So it has a high resilience, and it's hard to kind of push it into another state. You can see if there's a disturbance to this system, it changes, but then it returns back to its state very quickly. And these types of high resilience systems tend to have a stable variance structure. On the contrast, here's a low resilience system. You can see it doesn't have a well-defined valley. The walls are kind of gradual, so if I disturb it, it comes back slowly. It might not even come back at all, and it's easy to kind of push it into another state. This is a picture of a low resilience system, and a system like this, if I have a disturbance, it'll change, it'll come back slowly or kind of not at all. And the idea is that these low resilience systems have a different type of variance structure, a much less stable variance structure. And so the idea, and this is adopted from economics, and I'll go into this a little bit, is if you're monitoring a system and your variance structure shifts on something like this, to something like this, you're supposed to wake up and say, maybe this is an early warning signal that my system is changing. And again, economists have been doing this for a long time. We'll come back to this, but they look at data and they see changes in the variance, and is that an early warning signal that the system is changing? And so we're hoping to, and I'm going to give some examples of can we use this to look at early warning signals in environmental systems and use this to help us measure and ultimately manage for resilience. Okay, so where am I doing this? I want to introduce my research site. Is the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest, which is in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, where people have been studying ecological systems since the 50s. And this picture was taken in the 70s. This is clear, the hairstyles in here are clear evidence that the 70s occurred. Many of the people in this room would like to deny that the 70s occurred. But you look at my college yearbook, it's incontrovertible. So the Hubbard Brook site was established in 1955 by the USDA Forest Service as a hydrological laboratory. And in the early 60s, there were a bunch of university scientists who formed this incredible synergy with the Forest Service scientists to use these watersheds, this hydrologic laboratory, for ecosystem research. And they developed this idea of the small watershed approach, which was a huge advance in ecosystem science because you could use these watersheds as realistic units for experimental studies in ecosystems. In medicine, we have rats, or we have mice that we use, and we have Drosophila in biology, tobacco mosaic virus. Many disciplines have a study unit that propels advances, and the small watershed approach was very useful in ecology beginning in the 60s. And since 1987, Hubbard Brook has been part of the long-term ecological research network, which I'll introduce here. So the long-term ecological research network is funded by the National Science Foundation, and it's a centerpiece of ecosystem research in the US. It recognizes that ecosystems are complex entities, they change slowly, and so they fund these grants. There are 28 of these sites, and the grants are 6-year grants with an expectation of renewal. So at Hubbard Brook, we've been funded since 1987 in these 6-year increments from the National Science Foundation. There's a bunch of sites in the Northeast, there's a bunch of sites in the Southwest, there are sites in Alaska, there's some coastal sites, there's sites in Antarctica, and we're very proud to be part of the LTER network at Hubbard Brook. Here's a map of the experimental forest. It's about 800 hectares, and the highlight of the forest is the series of these small experimental watershed units up in this corner of the watershed. I'll show you a picture of these. So this is a picture taken in 1985, and you can see each of these are watershed units. All the land area drains to this point. And these watersheds have been treated differently over time. So these different forestry treatments, there's a reference watershed here, there's a reference watershed here, there's a reference watershed here. And the idea with the watershed approach is that we can learn about these ecosystem units by measuring the quantity and the quality of the water that drains out of these units. And it's very analogous to a urinalysis in medicine. So if you go to a physician, the physician will sample the urine and look at the chemistry of the urine to infer something about the health or function of the system, which in this case is the patient. And so in these watersheds, we collect the water, we analyze the chemistry, and we learn something about how the system is functioning. And we apply, it's very useful in a disturbance and response mode. So if you disturb the system by, say, cutting the trees down or adding a chemical stress, that's then reflected in the chemistry of the water, just like stress or disease is reflected in the chemistry of urine. You analyze the response, you use that to infer what are the internal dynamics that are composing that response. So the watershed approach, as I mentioned, has been super useful in these long-term studies, in ecology in general and Hubbard Brook in particular. Here's just another diagram of the watershed approach. So these watersheds have a watertight bedrock, which really helps. So you can balance the water bucket. If you can measure the precipitation coming in and you measure the stream flow coming out at a weir, you can then calculate evapotranspiration and you can calculate element budgets. If you have the water budgets, then you can measure the chemistry and calculate the element budgets. Again, precipitate elements coming in, which you sample in these precipitation collectors, and then elements going out in the stream flow. We are always pushing the frontiers of measurement technology at Hubbard Brook, and so you'll see here this picture was taken in the 60s. You know, and I really like showing this picture because they were up there in the 60s and they kind of threw this. All right, let's throw a plastic funnel out there and see what the precipitation chemistry is. And then, sure enough, you know, the precipitation chemistry was really acidic. they're kind of scratching their heads, maybe that's why our hair's falling out. But they discovered that acid rain, which had been discovered in Europe, was actually a problem in the Northeast in America. They didn't expect it to be. And so it started with very simple technology and has evolved over time, very cautiously. So when you change the technology, we overlap them for a year. I know there's a lot of people here who are interested in measuring things. So I have to talk about this a little bit. But when we switched from this funnel to a different funnel, they insisted on running both funnels side by side for a year to be sure that the change was a real change and not a change due to the fact that you were using a different funnel. And so you get more high technology stuff. And then weirs, right? So we have lots of weirs to sample these streams. And again, the water comes through a control section, and you can measure, and a lot of it was just done with chart recorders. And then we switched from the chart recorders to digital ones, but very, very cautiously, we've been upgrading the technology for these watersheds. Now, they were interested in resilience at Hubbard Brook going back to the beginning, back into the 60s. They were really interested in, these were northern hardwood forests. So the northern hardwood forest is beech, maple, birch, yellow birch, and a little bit of red spruce interspersed. And these were systems that were northern hardwood forests, and if you would cut them down, or if they would fall down, northern hardwood forests would grow back. And they were like, well, so they were wondering about the resilience of these systems, especially in the face of clear cutting, which was quite common in the 60s. But they knew that so they suspected these were pretty resilient systems because they would fall down and they would come back. But here's a site that you can see from Hubbard Brook that is dominated by jack pine, which is a boreal species. It's not a northern hardwood species. And so people would scratch their head. They're going, what happened over the top of this mountain that switched it? Obviously, it exceeded the resilience and pushed it into a different state. And what there was, they went back a couple hundred years ago, there had been a fire on the top of this mountain. All the soil had washed away. And so that exceeded the resilience of the system. And the northern hardwood forest couldn't grow back. And the northern hardwood forest will not grow back for several thousand years until new soil forms. And so this was a real piece of evidence that, yes, resistance and resilience, but that sufficiently large disturbances could push these systems into an alternative stable state or exceed the resilience. Now, they were real interested in this in the context of clear cutting. So in the early 60s in New Hampshire and throughout New England, there was a lot of clear cutting, and clear cuts kind of focused them on. If you're driving down the highway and you see these clear cuts and you say, how long can we do that before these forests are not going to be forests anymore? How many times can we cut them back and northern hardwood forests are growing back? So they designed an experiment to try and test the limits of resilience. And the basic idea was, could we push the system a little bit harder to kind of push it into the abyss, into another stable state? So they designed this experiment in 1965. They cut all the trees and then left them on top of the snow in 1965. And they then prevented the regrowth of that forest for 3 years. So for 3 years, they came out and sprayed herbicides to prevent the regrowth. This is a pretty extreme treatment. The herbicide was 2,4,5-T. Does anyone know what 2,4,5-T is? It's Agent Orange, right? At the time, they didn't know that it was Agent Orange, but it was a very extreme treatment. And so the idea was, okay, we're going to apply this extreme treatment. Would a northern hardwood forest grow back? Now, we're still studying this watershed 60 years later, and it doesn't look any different than other 60-year-old watersheds in the White Mountains. It's an amazing example of resilience. So we've been tracking, this is the 30-year data, but we've continued to track it, and this is the distribution. This is the above-ground net primary production. There's the distribution of different tree species. And again, this system looks pretty much like any other 60-year-old system in the White Mountains. And it is an amazing example of resilience, and it's not like these are deep, rich soils. I mean, these are steep soils on rocky soils, but yet they're quite resilient. And we've seen lots of examples in ecosystem studies that systems have really impressive amounts of resilience. They come back. But we have a hypothesis that if we did the same experiment today, we wouldn't get the same result. So we have a hypothesis that the resilience has been decreased because of 50 years of acid rain and climate change, and these systems are not the same as they were in 1965. And in particular, we're concerned that acid rain has depleted calcium, particularly in the soil. So if you look at this graph here, tens of thousands of kilos of calcium that were present in the soils in the 50s have been leached away by decades of acid rain. Acid rain displaces calcium-based cations like calcium and magnesium and potassium from the soil, And if you think about, if you disturb a system, if I knock over these trees, I'm going to want some calcium, right, to help it. The calcium is an important nutrient, and if I disturb the system, I'm going to want calcium in the system to help it regrow. And so if I've depleted all this calcium, I have a real hypothesis that the resilience has been exceeded. And so I immediately said, well, we need to write some grants to repeat this experiment. And so we wrote proposals to repeat this experiment, and the reviewers laughed and laughed, and deep belly laughed. So think about getting approval to do this experiment now. I mean, I had some of my graduate students said, what kind of morality do you have to do an experiment like that? And so it'd be very expensive, and it would also be very specific. Like these watershed experiments, we learned a lot from these watershed experiments, but they're a little bit site-specific. So we became really interested in, are there some other ways that we could test ideas about changing resilience? Could we look at these systems and see, did these disturbances and the changes in the atmosphere cause changes in resilience? And so we began on this work to use early warning signals of change to illustrate changing resilience in these northern hardwood forests. And I highlight this is a paper, and this work was led by Alex Costa, who's a professor at the University of New Hampshire, who just did a wonderful job leading this work. So the idea, as I mentioned before, is borrowed from economics. And in economics, they spend a lot of time looking at a variety of data sources. In economics, they have lots of data. And so they look at these different data sources and they say, do we see some changes in the variance in these data that might be predicting of a recession or might be predicting of a recovery? And the economists like to say that they have successfully predicted 10 of the last 3 recessions. I don't know if anyone's ever heard that term, but it's an interesting thing to say. So think about that. We predicted 10 of the last 3 recessions, and in a certain way say, well, is that useful? I would argue it is. Right? As scientists, I would argue that as scientists, we're supposed to be looking out at society and saying, you might want to worry about this. I mean, we're supposed to be kind of looking around and saying, this might be a problem, this might be a problem. That's certainly what the economists are doing. So the economists are saying, well, we've had a change in this indicator. We think that might be indication of a recession. You should take your money and put it in the freezer or under the mattress. I don't know where you all put your money in Nebraska when things get bad. My mother used to put it under the mattress. I put it in the freezer. But in any case, maybe you should do it. And then, if you have a recession, your money's in the freezer. Or if you don't have a recession, you take it out of the freezer and you put it back under the mattress or back in the back or wherever you're going to do. But this idea of warning signals and leading indicators is, I think, something that we should be doing in science. We can discuss that later. So the idea is, could we use this economic framing to look at changes in resilience in our environmental systems? And again, the idea, I showed this before, but if I have an environmental system, and this has been applied extremely well they first started applying this in lakes, where you can collect high-resolution data with sensors, and if your variance structure changes from something like this to something like this, then maybe that's an indicator that the system is about to change to a different type of state, or is about to observe some type of decline or some type of change. So we focus on these changes in variance as a way of predicting resilience. Now, again, this has been done in economics where they have lots of data. And the question is, could we apply this to ecological data? And at Harvard Brook, we were lucky to do this because we have a long-term record. We have greater than 50 years for a lot of long-term records. And we have these watersheds that have been treated in different ways. So I can now test hypotheses, and I can say, well, okay, so this watershed that was treated very extremely in the 60s, maybe that shows less resilience than these watersheds that were treated more gently, say with strip cutting or with these whole tree harvests, or with my reference watersheds. So having long-term data on manipulated watersheds that were manipulated a long time ago, maybe gives me a chance to see, do these leading indicators work? Do they make sense given what we know in a well-studied system? The other thing that helps us at Harvard Brook is we've been monitoring lots of variables in these watersheds and also monitoring the environment. So over that time, the climate has changed a lot, and the air is a ton cleaner. So, and this is quite interesting in the Northeast, but there was a lot of acid in the pH of the rainfall has gone, acid rain has kind of disappeared. Sulfur levels in the atmosphere have dropped a lot. Ozone, which is tough on plants and animals, ozone has also kind of disappeared. So the air is a lot cleaner, and the climate is a lot warmer. So we've been monitoring these changes in a variety of watersheds and also monitoring changes in the environment along. So what are we looking at in early warning signals? So there's two groups of variables. There are ones associated with variability. So I look at a long data stream and I look at changes in the coefficient of variation or changes in autocorrelation, which are good indicators that the variance in my system is changing. Again, the example is, am I going from a system like this to a system like this? And those are, they call that in the resilience, they call that indicators of reduced ability to recover from perturbation. The other variance we look at is extremes in the data set. So skewness or kurtosis. So a skewed variable synthesis. I have a lot of low variables, but just a few really a lot of low values and then a few high variables. And kurtosis is I'd like to have a nice bell curve, but in kurtosis sometimes I have a long drawn out curve. I don't have a picture of those. But so we're looking at four indicators of changes in variance. We're looking at coefficient of variation, autocorrelation, and skewness and kurtosis. So let me walk you through some of these data. So we've been measuring calcium exports from these watersheds. And I have calcium exports, so here's my coefficient of variation, and here's my autocorrelation. Here's skewness, and here's kurtosis. And I have four indicators of resilience. Now the red line is watershed 2. This is the watershed that was treated really roughly in the 60s. This watershed over here, clear-cut and herbicide. And all four of my indicators are going up, meaning that resilience is declining. All my indicators of variance are going up. So coefficient of variation is going up, autocorrelation is going up, skewness is going up, and kurtosis is going up in this highly disturbed watershed. All my leading indicators are pointing towards this watershed's got some resilience problems. And if I compare that with a reference watershed, so this purple line is my reference watershed, all my indicators are going down, indicating increasing resilience. So coefficient of variation is going down, autocorrelation is going down, skewness is going down, kurtosis is going down. And this is exactly the kind of result that we hope to find. I know something about these watersheds. I have a reason to suspect that one of these watersheds might be less resilient than the other, and indeed all these indicators support that idea. Now what's interesting is, so what it suggests is that this very rough treatment 60 years ago has reduced the resilience of this system, and this system is now maybe, it's a little more vulnerable to perturbation. Our expectations for how this system should perform over time are probably reduced. And so this is potentially useful information for managing and predicting the landscape. The other thing that's interesting is in our reference watershed, it looks like resilience has increased over time. And this is also an interesting and important result, because if you think about if you're a tree in the woods at Hubbard Brook, well, it's warmer and it's wetter, there's a longer growing season, the air's a lot cleaner, I ought to be having a big picnic out there as a tree in the wood, and indeed they are. Right, so we have pretty high, like one of our signature species is red spruce. System was super susceptible to acid rain, was super susceptible to climate change, it's growing like crazy out there in the woods now. And so we see indicators as we suspect that indeed some of these disturbed systems have reduced resilience and and they are vulnerable to a changing environment, where these other systems that are less disturbed are actually taking advantage of environmental change and are becoming more resilient over time. So it suggests that these indicators are useful. Now, this is calcium biogeochemistry. It's the water center, so I figured I'd talk about calcium biogeochemistry. Many people are not so interested in calcium biogeochemistry, but they're interested in birds. So at Hubbard Brook, we also have 60-year data sets on birds. It's an amazing bird data set. And in particular, we have focused on the black-throated blue warbler, which is a migrating bird, and is beset with woes in its wintering grounds in the tropics, and it also has challenges with climate change and species change in the north. So here's the black-throated blue warbler, and again, all four of my indicators of variance are going up in the black-throated blue warbler, suggesting that resilience has been declining for the black-throated blue over time. And this is very consistent with the detailed studies that have been done at the site. On the other hand, some of these other species, so I've got the ovenbird and the least flycatcher, these appear to be much healthier populations, and they have either increasing resilience or a mixed signal. And so again, now birds, we're really interested in understanding which of our bird species are more vulnerable to disturbance and which ones are more robust. And we have some evidence here that that the black-throated blue, which we care quite a bit about as a species of conservation concern, we're showing trends in resilience, in declining resilience. Another thing that we've been monitoring for a long time, again, less this is since the 2000s, is bugs. So lepidopteran, right? So the lepidopterans are super important as food for birds. Are you all concerned about insect apocalypse? So the insect apocalypse gets a lot of press some places, but there's concern that global declines of insects. We see evidence that the insect populations are definitely showing declines in resilience. So this is just the biomass of lepidopterans in the forest for 20 years or so, and all our indicators of variance are going up, suggesting that the insect populations are indeed showing declining resilience and might be vulnerable to environmental disruption. There might be some mechanistic link to this idea of an insect apocalypse. Another thing we're interested in the forest is tree species. You get a lot of data by looking at tree rings in tree species, and so we've been looking at those over time. We have two species, sugar maple and American beech. We can see that for American beech, all our indicators of variance are going up. Looks like there's declining resilience in American beech. Makes a lot of sense with our measurements we make. We make lots of measurements of American beech. It's got a couple of diseases. It has a variety of problems, and indeed, it looks like it has got low resilience and is potentially poised to drop out of the system altogether. So all told, we analyzed 20 variables from the long-term data sets at Hubbard Brook, and more than half of them were showing trends in increases in variance and trends in early warning signals, suggesting declining resilience and the decreased ability to respond to shocks. And again, this was mostly done as a proof of concept, since these are places where we have measurements to know what these populations are doing, and are the early warning signals, these leading indicators, are they consistent with our measurements? And indeed, we have a pretty good proof of concept these early warning signals can function as empirical indicators of declining resilience. I'll come back to this at the end, but I would like to encourage everyone to go look at their data, right? So Andy's got flux tower data, he's got a lot of data. And he should be getting up now to go, and I've got to look at the variances are changing in the flux tower. And we have lots of data that I'm hoping that we can use this as a proof of concept and apply. Okay, I also wanted to talk a little bit about resilience in cities. Resilience in cities pushes us out of environmental systems into what we call socio-environmental systems. And there are kind of four ideas I wanted to just introduce that are useful in thinking about cities, about the idea of social, ecological, technical systems, ideas about risk and switching from a fail-safe approach to safe-to-fail. Let's talk about green infrastructure and a little bit about community-based participatory research. So my example is Hurricane Sandy. So in 2012, Hurricane Sandy, it was actually called Superstorm Sandy. It was a big hurricane, came, and it just beat the hell out of New York City. And I'll show you a map of where it just came. But it knocked out power in Manhattan for I don't know, like 5 or 6 days. Couldn't get gasoline. People were driving to my little town upstate to buy gasoline. Has anyone read the book Outland, set here in Lincoln? So it was a novel where Yellowstone volcano explodes, and a series of UNL graduate students save the world, building a portal to another dimension. It's a fun science fiction book, and especially since graduate students are at the key of it. But it was like that. Hurricane Sandy was the apocalypse, and again, Manhattan's got 6 million people, and in the dark, it's a scary place. And we know that Sandy is coming back, and we know that when Sandy comes back, they're going to be grouchy. I like to view that Sandy's coming back kind of like you have a grouchy aunt who leaves their phone on the table at Thanksgiving, and they drive down the road and has to come back and get the phone. So Sandy is coming back, maybe in 100 years, maybe this year, and it's probably the biggest issue that New York City is facing over the next 100 years. And all the cities on the East Coast are wondering, how are we going to deal with these enormous storms that are going to come back? And there's a real debate. Are we going to deal with it with giant flood walls, or are we going to take a more softer approach using green infrastructure and some of these new concepts of fail-safe and safe-to-fail? But in order to answer this question, what are we going to do? It requires a new type of science where we engage with communities. We need to engage, we'd argue that with every neighborhood and every stakeholder group in New York City, and I'm a professor at the City University of New York. And we argue that we're uniquely poised to do this because all our students, we have 250,000 students at the City University of New York, and they come from these neighborhoods. And so we're hoping to use this as a platform for a new kind of science. So here's the problem. Here's New York City. Here is Manhattan. This is Brooklyn and Queens, Staten Island, which we don't think about. The Bronx over here. And so here's New York City. And Sandy was a giant coastal storm that set a wall of water right into, it set a wall of water into coastal New Jersey, coastal Long Island, and then this is the Hudson River. It actually sent this, the storm surge went 100 miles up the Hudson River to past Albany to Troy, which is the state capital, because the Hudson is open. And so it sent a 5-foot wall of water all the way up, 100 feet up. Flooded the bottom of Manhattan, the power was out. And again, this focused the mind. So how do people respond to disasters like this? So the first thing was, we're going to build an enormous wall. Not only are we going to build an enormous wall, we're going to build 5 enormous walls. So we're going to build one over here to keep Long Island Sound out. The whole idea of keeping Long Island out of New York City is a popular idea. We're going to build one over here in the Rockaways to protect, because these beach communities here suffered a lot of damage in Sandy. We're going to build one here, again, farther out on Long Island to protect these bays and these communities over here. And then the really big one is this one that's going to go from, it's going to build across New York Harbor. There's going to be a barrier that's going to go from Coney Island to Sandy Hook in New Jersey. This is a good, what is it, 10 or 20 miles or so. And they've built these barriers in other parts of the world. They have them in London. They have them in the Netherlands. And this, of course, was very controversial, right? So they're very expensive. Is it going to alter the ecology? And is it really going to work? So people have been thinking about this since 2012, and they've been kind of looking out to sea. We're worried about what's coming out from sea, and while we've been looking out to sea, we've been getting whacked in the head from behind, because what's really been happening since that time is this change of the fluvial flooding is when you get storm surge and your rivers overflow. But what we've been getting is extreme rainfall events. That creates pluvial flooding, when the precipitation rate exceeds the rate of infiltration, and we've been getting these enormous floods like this in the city streets. You get these rainfall events. So now we're left with a real conundrum, right? So we don't know if we want to build these barriers. We don't know if they're going to work. But at the same time, we know they're not going to work to solve the pluvial flooding problem. And so we've got some real coastal resilience problems to deal with in New York. Where are we supposed to put all this flood water? Is the question. So we've been thinking about this. And so one idea, and it's the first one I wanted to introduce, was if we're going to solve these problems, we need to think of our environmental systems in a different way. And we like to think of them as social, ecological, technological systems. So if you think about the conundrum I've described in New York City, there's clearly a technological infrastructure domain. We're going to have to build something. There's clearly a social, economic domain, because these things are really expensive and who's going to pay for them. And then there's this ecological, biophysical domain. If we're going to build a barrier across New York Harbor, what's it going to do to the fish and all the other systems? And so the solutions have got to be in this kind of sweet spot that balances the technological, social, and the ecological, biophysical domain. This idea of thinking of environmental systems as social, ecological, technological systems is probably a useful idea. And a lot of this emerged. We had an Urban Resilience to Extreme Events Sustainability Research Network. This was a large group funded by the National Science Foundation. It was led by Nancy Grimm and Chuck Redmond at Arizona State. And we had 10 cities in North and South America. And this really developed this idea of sets or social, ecological, technological systems. Now probably so a real good place to apply this is our thinking about risk. So again, if you think about flooding risk and you think about Hurricane Sandy, our approach is to build big walls, large gray infrastructure. Kind of like the natural human approach is I need to protect myself with a big wall with low probability of failure. And those are great. It's a fail-safe approach. It's great until they fail, and then you're really in deep trouble, right? You end up with catastrophic failure when these fail. And given that there's non-stationarity, right? So we used to design bridges, and we used to design walls for some anticipated storm, but our ability to predict what those storms are going to be has declined quite a bit. And so the engineers and other people have started to think, well, maybe we need a different approach from the fail-safe approach. And so there's this idea of a safe-to-fail approach, which focuses on minimizing the consequences of the extreme event rather than minimizing the probability of damages. And this is very strongly rooted in resilience. The idea of, okay, water's going to come into the city. Can we get the water out of the city quickly? And can we minimize the damage to the system? You focus on protecting the critical services in the system rather than on just preventing the event altogether. It requires a more decentralized, autonomous approach, a lot of communication and collaboration. It's a real different way of dealing with risk. Now, as an ecologist, this seems like a great idea, but there's lots of questions about this. In particular, okay, you don't want to build a big wall. I'd like to build lots of softer, smaller green infrastructure features, which I'll talk about in a minute, but are they going to work? And there's lots of uncertainty. I know what a wall is going to do. You build me a wall, can you give me design specifications? A lot of engineers here in the room. We're good with this. The wall is this tall, it's this thick, it's going to resist this amount of flood. I'm building bioswales and I'm building a lot of green infrastructure. The design standards and their performance, there's a lot of work to be done on them. So will these softer, smaller features work is an uncertainty. The bigger uncertainty is will people believe that the softer, smaller features don't work? So I can go into these neighborhoods and I'd say, would you rather have this big wall, or would you rather have this nice bioswale, or an oyster reef, or some other type of green infrastructure feature? And I don't know what people are going to say. And so this is a question where we really need to engage with communities and find out, well, what do they really want? How do they want to solve these problems? And then, of course, then it raises the question of who's going to get the nice-looking features and who's going to get the ugly features. There's lots of concerns about equity in the way these are going to be distributed. So, again, we need community-driven participatory research to address these questions, but this idea of changing the way we deal with risk is a question that graduate students in the Water Science Center should, and other places, these should be keeping us busy for a while. A lot of this research, and then another, to me, is exciting here is this idea of green infrastructure. So we're very excited about using natural and nature-based solutions to solve some of these resilience problems. To the extent that they work as well as walls is good. They also provide ancillary benefits, in that they provide green benefits and they provide carbon sequestration. They cool the climate. They provide many ancillary benefits. But how do we think about green infrastructure? So one way of thinking about green infrastructure is along an eco-techno spectrum. So some of our green infrastructure features in cities and other human settlements are on the natural side of things, remnant wetlands and remnant forests. And then at the other extreme are these highly engineered features like porous pavement or these bioswales. They're more at the techno end of the spectrum. And there's lots of things in between, like street trees and urban agriculture. And so we worked with a postdoc, Marissa Matzler, who proposed this eco-techno spectrum and said this might be a really good way to think about, to organize our thoughts about nature-based solutions, in particular, the social, political, and financial aspects of green infrastructure. So who benefits from different types of facilities, right? So there's different types of green infrastructure along the spectrum. Who interacts with these facility types and who benefits from them? Who makes the decisions about different types of features? And then who pays for the different types of features? So green infrastructure, to me, is another super exciting area of research that involves a social, ecological, technical approach. I mean, there's a lot of people measuring soil and vegetation variables in these, but there's also lots of stuff about social acceptance and political decision-making and financial green infrastructure, I think, is a fun topic. Okay, so in conclusion, I think we're at an exciting time and that we are really poised to be able to use resilience as a conceptual and practical tool to deal with the crazy, wacky, non-stationary world that we live in. And again, we get this when we talk with stakeholders. You know, we work in the White Mountains for a long time, and we talk to the Nature Conservancy and other people. They say, you know, what should we be researching? They say, resilience is what we need to know. We need to know, can we absorb shocks? Can we recover quickly? And I think we're really making progress. I think it's exciting. So the question is, can we use these early warning signals? And so some of the things that we're moving forward on is we develop measures of ecological resilience, and we compare those with measures of social and economic vulnerability and resilience. We're looking at the links between environmental resilience and then more broader impacts of resilience as a way of engaging with stakeholders. We're quite excited about engaging with using these these indicators as a way of engaging urban residents about extreme events. Again, we're hoping to talk to every neighborhood in New York City, there's a lot of neighborhoods in New York City, about this. And I want Andy and the rest of you to get out there and look for early warning signals in all kinds of environmental data, whether it's water quality, crop yield, soil moisture. We're kind of excited that maybe we can develop, because again, our ability to collect high-resolution data has just exploded. And can we spend some time looking at the variance structure in that data to learn something about vulnerability and resilience of our systems? I also think that resilient science conceptually is going to require some broader thinking. And again, the social scientists have helped us here. Is resilience always good? Right? I've been working in Baltimore for 25 years. And I've got some neighborhoods in Baltimore that I started working there that were really underserved. They were economically depressed. They had real problems. 25 years later, they still have real problems. You know, there are lots of things that where we targeted as unfavorable conditions for environmental systems, and they're hard to get out of those unfavorable. You know, we could argue in lots of our agricultural systems, we've been trying to get change in them for a long period of time. Change is slow to come. So resilience, systems in undesirable states can be resilient. And I think that, again, the social scientists have expanded our thinking about that. We need to think about that. And then there's the other question that people kind of push it from the other side is, okay, it's a wacky world. We should try and manage for resilience and predict resilience. That's fine. But maybe we should try and make the world a little less wacky. Right? So if we have all these stressors that are causing our systems to be unpredictable, maybe we should try and reduce some of those stressors. And again, one of the great things about resilience as a boundary spanning object, we think about it, you know, as individuals, or we think about it as communities, right? And so yeah, I think I'm a resilient individual, but maybe if my life wasn't so crazy, maybe I wouldn't need to worry so much about resilience. So that's another thought that again comes from us from multidisciplinary interactions. Yes, resilience is important, but we should also remember that we should be focusing on making the world less crazy, removing some of the disturbances and perturbations that necessitate. In any case, I think this is an exciting area. I think it's going to keep us busy for a long time. And thank you very much for your attention. I would be glad to take some questions, and I would be delighted if people wanted to argue with me about it.
Thank you very much. That was a really good talk. I'm kind of curious about the concept of scale with respect to resilience and resistance, and how do we figure out what kind of temporal but also spatial scales we need to be measuring these variables at, and to what end?
So scale is a great question. So I'm an ecosystem ecologist, and one of the great challenges in ecosystem ecology has been, what are the boundaries of the ecosystem? Right? So you're talking about a forest ecosystem, where does it start, where does it end? And the boundary of an ecosystem is whatever the hell I tell you it is. And it's the same thing in this resilience analysis, right? So if I'm studying forest ecosystems, I could be just a forest stand I just draw a box around. Or it could be a forest on a particular soil. It could be an agricultural field. In ecosystem science, the boundary is always flexible, depending on either some kind of natural boundary or just the convenience of the investigator. So for these resilience analyses, we have the same flexibility with balance. So at Hubbard Brook, I'm looking at watershed scale biogeochemistry, but my birds don't understand the watersheds, and so there it's just it's just my sampling plot at Hubbard Brook. I had to find it. Andy's flux tower. I want to look at variance. He's measured a lot of things within those flux towers. I'd like to look at that. Would be flux tower footprints are great ecosystem boundaries. So it could be very small. And again, a lot of this work was developed in lakes. So there were small lakes with lots of sensors in them, and that was the scale of the system. In economics, they look at the economic system of the gross domestic product of a state or of a nation of the globe, and so you can do much larger ones. And I think we have these global greening maps. So the world, if you look at these global maps of net productivity, above ground net productivity, the world is getting greener over time. And so but is the variation in greenness going up? And so we could, I argue that this can be applied at all kinds of different scales. Spatial and temporal. It's a lot of data handling. So I presented this work, and you have to do a lot of work to detrend the data. There's a lot of data handling and data preparation to do, but Alice can talk to you about it. Other
the skewness and kurtosis coefficient of variance. So remember from my sedimentology class that those are variables when describing particle size distribution. How, and I sort of remember that they're characteristic of certain depositional environments. How does the ecological measurements that you're measuring, what's the theory behind that for leading indicators?
Yeah, and so, I mean, they all are based on, you make the normal distribution of data, right? And I hope I've got a normal distribution of data.
Yeah.
You know, so skewness is everything's off to the left and with a little tail. The kurtosis is instead of having this nice peak, it just kind of goes like this. And so as long as you have observations and a mean and a distribution, you can calculate any of these variables. And so, and they're kind of simple ones. I mean, so and I think you could probably, and there's probably work to get at more sophisticated indicators of variance. But these ones can be applied to any data set. They work better when you have thousands of measurements. I don't know if we all remember when we took statistics.
Yeah.
Right, you're all environmental scientists and you have 30 observations and you're really proud of yourself, you got 30 observations, and you're going to apply statistical techniques that are designed for data sets where you have 3,000 observations. And I think it's the same thing here. But now we've got sensor data. And so I think we're going to have better luck applying some of these. I mean, even at Hubbard Brook, you know, those bird counts and those insect counts, those are hard to get. Yeah. And so I think we're pushing the limits with these, but now if we can get sensor data, we can do a lot. That's why this started in lakes, where you're just looking at oxygen levels in a lake, and you can have thousands and thousands of things.
And you showed an example where you used calcium. Are there other water quality measurements that where this would be tested?
So in this paper, we did nitrogen and calcium, and we you know, at Hubbard Brook we measure a full suite of chemistry. So we measure all the cations, all the anions, we measure acid neutralizing capacity. And I think she probably ran them all.
Okay.
So we could do a lot.
Okay.
And again, there's a lot of, it makes you want to go into the USGS long-term data sets. You know, it makes you want to look at other data sets.
Okay.
Are there any like similar experiments or systems that you can compare your data to?
Well, so that's a very good question. Yes and no, right? So we have this long-term ecological research network, and so there are other sites in there that have similar data to Hubbard Brook. In particular, there are several of the long-term ecological research sites are watershed-based. There's one in Oregon, there's one in North Carolina, there's several of them, and so we would like to get their data and compare them. The other, I think, real opportunity for this is going to be the National Ecological Observatory Network, NEON, which is collecting a lot of data at a lot of sites in a very standardized way, making the data instantly available to the public. And so I think that we're going to have lots of opportunities to test this in other systems. Mariflux is the other one, where it's a lot of numbers over the long term.
I have a question here. In the presentation here, I didn't see anything bringing in the governmental entity. In other words, here in the local level, we have been notified by the Corps of Engineers, hey, Lincoln's pouring too much concrete for the capacity of Salt Creek. Okay, okay, how do we begin to tie all this into what we do with Salt Creek and then the planning horizon? Everything now is based on a 100-year event. They want, the city of Lincoln is pushing the natural resource district to fund 500-year study. Now, to me, you know, I sat on that board, and you come to me and tell me I want a 500-year study, I want money for that. I said, hey, boys, let's put this thing into perspective. And I don't see anything in your presentation here that talks about the future.
So that's kind of what I was getting at in the New York City example, right? So New York City has to make the same decision about, we know this big hurricane's coming back. We know we have these extreme rainfall events. What are we going to do about it? And so there's one is we could say, well, we could treat it like a, instead of, they used to plan for a 100-year storm, they'd say the same thing, well, we don't really know when it's coming or how big it's going to be, so we'll just plan for a 500-year storm and we'll just build a bigger wall. But there's the recognition that maybe that's not going to work, and instead of building for the 500-year storm, we're going to have to recognize that, okay, Salt Creek is going to flood, how do we then say, okay, when the Salt Creek floods, where's it going to flood? How quickly can we get that water out of there? And how can we allow this event to occur and minimize the consequences of the event? That's the whole idea of the safe to fail approach. Best thing your board needs to do is you need to take a trip to Phoenix, especially in February. It's really nice in Phoenix. There's a place called Indian Bend Wash. And so, Jessica, you probably know Indian Bend Wash. It's my favorite example of advanced planning. So there's a desert stream. Desert streams are naturally flashing. And then you build a city around the desert stream and you end up with a real flood hazard. And so as they were developing around Indian Bend Wash, they said, we could either put this in an enormous trench, or we could leave the floodplain as a park. So they made it as a park, and it's a park 350 days of the year, and it's flooded 12 days of the year. Or how many days of the year? 365? 15 days a year. And so it's a classic example of this kind of safe-to-fail, flexible approach. And it's something that I think our planning boards need to consider. Now, how are we going to do that? And so we have to do that in a different way, where it used to be instead of the Corps of Engineers makes a recommendation, the planning board makes a recommendation, they bicker, and something is built, and no one ever asks the community until after it's done. And now there's a question of, if we're going to do this, we need to do this more engaged approach, where we engage with the community and say, here's the problem we face, how do you think we should go about doing this? And so I think that the social, ecological, technological approach, and this idea of thinking differently about the way to deal with risk is the way we're supposed to go through into the future. And it's not easy. So for example, they did this in one part of New York City, the Lower East Side. They had a plan, they got the community together, they came to some type of agreement with the community about this plan or what they were going to do. But then they got some engineers to look at it, and the engineers said, this is a nice plan, but it's not going to work. And so then they went back to them and said, this is not going to work, we're going to need to build a berm, and a bunch of ugly stuff. And the community got really angry about that. So I think we need a new kind of science and a new kind of a way of engaging with the communities, but it's going to be hard. So I think we need to think about new approaches to dealing with risk, and I think we need to think about new ways of planning, which involve more interaction with them.
To go just a bit further on the planning side, how can this be incorporated into evaluating? You have that whole spectrum of ecological to technical, to evaluating those different ones to see what their impacts are on the resilience of the system. Are there models out there? Like, how do you evaluate your set of options?
So I'm a little, let me say appalled, but there's not, right? We're very excited about nature-based solutions. The idea of nature-based solutions has stimulated this huge burst of creativity in landscape designers and engineers and architects and ecologists. Yeah, we can make bioswales and we can make wetlands and oyster reefs. But we still don't know that much about their performance, and that's where I think all of these graduate students need to be getting out there and doing nature-based solutions research, so that we can then say, here's what you can expect from this feature. Anything that has growth, I plant a lot of things in my yard. Some grow, a lot of them die, and so I'm nervous about bioswales, and so I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, because then we need to go and ask people, well, what do you think? What do you prefer? And what do people, I do class trips in New York City where we go look at, in New York City we have a big combined sewer overflow problem. I don't know if you have that problem in the cities here. But so I can deal with it with a bunch of green infrastructure, or I can deal with a bunch of really enormous tanks to capture the stormwater. We can take the class, we go look at some green infrastructure. We have to look at green infrastructure features like late in March. Green infrastructure doesn't look so good late in March. It's got plants are dead, there's a bunch of garbage in them. And then they were like, I don't know, maybe give me the tank. So I think we need, there's a lot, this is an exciting area of research, because there's been a lot of good creative work, but we need to say, we need models and we need design specs about what we can expect from these, and then do people want them.
Is there anything to learn from our eastern cities like Seoul or Taipei, Manila, who are constantly devastated by these typhoons? 30 inches of rain or 20 inches of rain, not uncommon for those cities. How they really deal with overloading of the infrastructure?
Well, this is why I've been going to India. Right, so I'm teaching, I'm lecturing in a class, and we were talking about going east from India. We were talking about going to India earlier. And so I'm talking about fail safe and safe to fail. And this Indian graduate student I work with now, she says, now hold on a second. You know, and she had just been in Mumbai and it had rained 13 inches in 2 hours or something like that. She said, you know, there's something to be learned by comparing the eastern and the western cities. So in some ways, Mumbai is a lot more resilient than New York, and in certain ways, it's a lot less resilient than New York. And so comparative studies, and that was one of the things that was useful about this urban resilience to extreme network, to extreme events, UREX network. We had 10 cities. North American cities, hot ones, dry ones, cold ones, wet ones, and then some cities in Mexico and South America. And I think the comparative studies, we have a lot to learn from each other, which is why we've been running these student exchanges between the City University of New York and universities in India. I think there's a lot to do. I think we have some things to contribute to them, and they have some things to contribute to us.
Yeah, so there's also a term, social environmental sustainability. So between the concepts, the social ecological resilience and the social environmental sustainability. So what are the differences in your opinion?
So I guess I say the question again.
Yeah, so there's also a term very common, that's the social environmental sustainability. And you talked the social ecological resilience. So these two terms, these two concepts, so what are the differences?
Yeah, so are the difference between, because I had this question at the beginning, like, so in a classical sustainability, I have economics, environment, equity. And this is different, right? So this is a social system, a technological system, and an economic system. And so it's a little different, and it's definitely the SETS approach, this new approach is definitely focused on solutions to managing environmental systems to deal with these extreme events. So now I'm proposing a solution. I've got a problem and I've got a solution, and I know that there's a technological aspect to it, and I know there's an economic aspect to it, and I know there's an ecological aspect. It's a little more limited than the broader sustainability context. And the broader so the broader sustainability context in particular causes you to deal with social dynamics more strictly. So in particular the equity approach. So they are a little different. This one's a little more focused on solutions. And there's a nice paper I could send you that kind of goes into that subject. But it's a good question. I had the same question.
Is sustainability a little easier to define than resilient?
Is what easier?
Is sustainability a little easier to define than resilient?
I think so.
Okay.
I think so. Because I like to say, I got a bachelor's degree in environmental science in 1980, and there was no such thing as sustainability. And so now we have, if we're going to solve any of these problems, we have to think about environment, we have to think about economics, and we have to think about equity. And that's pretty easy to define. And I think it's a huge advance. I just think it means if we're really going to go about these, we need to think about these three things, and we didn't used to think that way. So no one talked about sustainability in 1980. Now every city and every state and every country has a sustainability plan and a sustainability office. They're hiring our undergraduate and graduate students. And so yeah, I do think sustainability is a little bit easier to define than resilience. But again, I think everybody has in their head what resilience is. All right, my ability to bounce back, whether it's me, whether it's my family, whether it's my town, whether it's my environmental system. But beyond that, kind of just the concept of resilience is pretty good, but beyond that, the definition gets sticky. But again, people could argue, yeah, I do think sustainability is easier to define.
Well, I hate to break up a good discussion, but we're running over time a little bit, so let's thank you.